Everyone, and thank you for joining us for the April 8th meeting of the Mayor's OKC Law Enforcement Task Force. Glad that all of you could be with us today. As usual, I do have a few announcements that I need to make. First of all, I am asking that all participants stay muted until they are recognized to speak. Task force members will be allowed to ask questions at the appropriate time. Please use the Zoom feature, hand raise feature to speak. The system automatically cues speakers in the order that their hands were raised. And please keep in mind that with such a large number of task force members on the call, we can't always see you on the screen if you physically raise your hand. Next, if the video conference is disconnected at any time during the meeting shall be stopped and reconvened once the audio and video connection is restored. If communications are unable to be restored within 15 minutes, items remaining will be placed on the next scheduled meeting agenda. And all task force agenda and document articles are located on okc.gov, www.okc.gov. Next, I would like to introduce a new task force member that is joining us for the first time today. Sidna Madden. Sidna, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks
Great.
for having me.
Thank you. Great. Sidna is the executive director of the Oklahoma Statewide Independent Living Council. She serves on many boards and commissions statewide that work on behalf of people with disabilities, including the Governor's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. Sidna is also the chair of the Oklahoma City Mayor's Committee on Disability Concerns. Sidna, again, is a result of a request by task force members to add someone from the disability community. And I would like to let you know that I am still working on the representative from the mental health community and one from the autism community, and hope to have those people identified and on board by the time we have our next meeting. But thank you, Sidna, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Sidna, you have any comments?
I don't, just thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us. Okay, at this point, I will turn the mic over to Ganesha Martin.
Thank you, MT, and good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you all today. And as I was thinking about getting on this call earlier and preparing and thinking about thanking you, I really want to go a little bit deeper because, you know, sometimes that's just kind of performative and we say thank you for showing up. But I just want to bring us in the room right now. I've spent a lot of time this past week with folks from the Oklahoma City community. And I just want us to be reminded of why we're here, why you're sitting in those chairs today. You were asked and chosen to represent your community and bring their voices into this room. And so I just really want to express my appreciation for you showing up. Everybody has crisis going on with family, with work, with all sorts of things. And so this has been a process, a long process for some. And so I just want to remind us how important the fact that you are actually here and showing up and bringing the folks that you represent into the room, how important that is. Next, and also I want to remind you that at any point, at any time during this process, if I can be helpful in making sure that you feel like this process is fruitful for you and those that you represent, you can always reach out to me. We can always have a conversation about that. I also just want to give some shout outs. Like I said, I've talked to a lot of community, but I've been in communication with about 6 or 7 of you back and forth this week, helping me with listening sessions and putting me in contact with community members. We've had some really good listening sessions this week. And so I really do appreciate that and look forward to working with the rest of you all. Right now, what I want to do is I want to give you guys some updates on the task force, just because you might have missed a couple of things in email. Then I'm going to set and tell you what the agenda is for today and the purpose is today. And then we will move forward in the agenda. So a couple of updates. As you know, there is going to be a town hall on Monday at 6 o'clock. There will not be presentations. There will not be a lot of platitudes. That is not the point of that gathering. We will start with just setting the scene so that people know what we're here for, reiterating the goals of the task force and the working group. But that is primarily to hear from community, their experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, and also what they want to see changed in Oklahoma City to make things better for them and their community members. So that's what that is for. I think you all received the flyer. So if you would continue to promote that event, that is what it's going to be about. The next thing, when we first came aboard, we took an informal pulse check to see if you all wanted to do subcommittees. The overwhelming majority of you said yes, because these meetings are, once a month, and even though it's 2 hours, we breeze through them. And so we wanted to get some of that hard work done in the subcommittees. I'll tell you that the last subcommittees, there were 2 people that came to one and 3 people came to the other one. So what I'm going to do is, after this meeting, I'm going to send out the Zoom links and the times again to everyone. I would encourage you all to come because, like I said, this process is going to end fairly quickly. And in July, we will need to have some draft recommendations. To that end, the next meetings after these 2, certainly if there's community that want to speak up, we'll give room for that. But we are going to start talking about recommendations so that we can really start getting some things down on paper and hopefully feeling like we're getting some momentum going. Next, there was at the suggestion of, I think, some of the Oversight Committee members, there has been a phone number that has been set up so that people can call in and leave their thoughts and concerns on this process and the issues before us. I will include that as well in the update so that you all have that. There also has been some conversations about the city setting up a website, or at least a landing page, so that there is one place for all of the information you all can direct people to. People can understand what the task force is about, and also find the different ways to leave their input. So that is being worked on. And as always, we continue to set up the listening sessions. And so you always can be in contact with me about that. So the way we have this set up today is, as you know, there's 2 issues before the task force. One is de-escalation, which we had some conversations about in the last task force meeting. And then the other one is civilian oversight. And so what we are going to have today is hopefully, and these conversations started in the subcommittee, but what we're going to do today is have some subject matter experts to talk about some different methodologies and best practices in civilian oversight. There are different methods, and they run the gamut from what you have now, all the way up to inspector generals and whole other offices being created. And so we're going to need to come to the forefront with some recommendations. And I want you all to be educated about and have some awareness about what's out there as possibilities. So we're going to start out with Ray Kelly from 21CP, who is going to give a presentation on a couple of those models. And I will just say Ray Kelly has a lot of experience in this space, but he was specifically tasked with helping in Baltimore City put together what we call the CODIF Community Oversight Task Force, where they all came together for about a year, I think, and looked at best practices across the country, talked to people across the country, and came up with recommendations for the mayor on oversight model. So he's going to do a presentation there. And then we've also have a panel that is joining us. I'll give you their bio when it's time, but these are folks that have spent their professional careers in civilian oversight. They're going to do a quick presentation, tell you the pros and cons, the things based on their experience. And then you are going to have an opportunity to ask them questions so that you can get some clarity around anything that they presented. And then that will be our process today. Does anybody have any questions or concerns that they want to bring up before I turn it over to Mr. Ray Kelly? All right, seeing none. Ray, the floor is yours. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ganesha. And I'm going to check in with Sharita. Am I good to go? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, so I'm going to do a presentation more of what is community oversight, defining it so we can have an understanding moving forward. And then we'll kind of go into some of the current models and best practices. So for efficiency reasons, we want to stay with the task force's format. So I do have breaks in the presentation for questions, but I'd like to suggest if you have a question while I'm presenting to put it in the chat. And I also want to invite some of our subject matter experts that know the answers to the questions in the chat to volunteer to answer them when they come, because I'm going to be talking a lot and there's a lot to cover. This is going to be about a 20-25 minute presentation. So I'm going to be needing some breath. So I'm hoping everybody can step in and help. So I'm going to try to share my screen so you don't have to look at me for 20 minutes.
And Ray, just so you know, there is not a chat function here. So we will be looking for the raised hand to help you out there. Primarily MT takes care of that, but I'll also try to help as well. So if folks want to interrupt, Ray, I'm sure is fine with that.
I'm definitely okay with interrupting. Can everyone see the shared screen?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
All right. So we want to start just by outlining what we're here to do. This presentation is not about us making recommendations to you guys about what you should do with civilian oversight, but more giving ideas and best practices of what works in different locales around the country. This engagement is kind of different because a lot of the best practices that are recognized around this country were actually implemented by a lot of the panelists and subject matter experts that are actually on this call today. So a lot of these folks will have a better understanding of the intricacies on that individual component for that individual city. So that's a good thing going we had there. So we want to just jump into what is community oversight? How do we define oversight when we're discussing police? So this is the blanket definition. Police oversight is also referred to as civilian oversight because a group of non-police individuals selected to oversee and review the actions of the police department, including any complaints or concerns against the department or its officers. So I think we have to go beyond those concise words and understand why there's a need for oversight. And it's important to recognize that we're not in these spaces because everything is great and the police are 100% everything that the community needs, and there aren't issues, be they racial bias issues, community profiling issues, whatever the case. We are here because there have been issues, and the structure created over a century of what we know as policing has kind of created a situation where we have to constantly ask the question, who polices the police? And that's why you have this onslaught of community oversight entities, because we have to decide who the police department is going to be held accountable to. So a big piece of the drive for civilian oversight is accountability. So this is a synopsis from the American Police Officers Alliance on why we need civilian oversight. Police conduct is a sensitive subject for a lot of people. More police oversight boards are being created with the goal in mind that both communities and police departments feel like situations and complaints are handled fairly. So that's kind of the blanket agreed upon, politically correct reason for these type entities. But that reason for that accountability changes when you hear that same objective presented from an advocate's point of view. So it says, police usually investigate and decide what, if any, consequences their fellow officers should face in cases of misconduct. Under this system, that's the present system, fewer than 1 in every 12 complaints of police misconduct nationwide results in some kind of disciplinary action against the officers responsible. Communities need an urgent way to ensure police officers are held accountable for police violence. So the perspective is from an administrative police point of view that, okay, we have some issues and we need to have a outside eye. We're willing to accept an outside eye looking in, where the advocates feel like we've been going through this abuse and misconduct for decades, and we want the police department to be held accountable to the community that one pays them and that they're sworn to protect and serve. So I think I want to pause right there so we can have an understanding of what civilian oversight not only is defined as a national term, but how that could possibly look in Oklahoma City. And I want to pause right there before we actually go into models to answer any questions that someone might have about how Oklahoma City specifically adheres or sees or interprets civilian oversight.
Ray, I see a hand up from Mark Nelson.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mark Nelson, can you hear me?
I sure can.
A couple of questions. Who makes up the American Police Officers Alliance?
So the America's Police Officers Alliance is a number of unions from around the country, as well as police commanders and chiefs. And they're represented on a lot of national legislative scales.
Okay, I will Google it later. I'm in my vehicle and couldn't. So there's been a lot of verbiage used. I don't know how tied together all of it is related to. So maybe you can just kind of comment on some of the thoughts that I have about 1 in 12 complaints result in discipline, but then at the end of that, there's a reference to police violence. What is police violence according to Campaign Zero? And are those stats reflective of that, or just complaints in general about alleged misconduct, but not necessarily misconduct that would be classified as police violence? There was a lot in those slides that you showed that I just have questions about, and maybe if you could just extrapolate on that just a little bit.
The 1 in 12 is a national statistic nationwide of formalized. These are actual complaints that are written and submitted by civilians against police officers nationwide. And only 1 in 12 leads to any level of discipline. So that's where that statistic comes from. I think historically, even now on the national news, we are recognizing that police violence is a real thing. It's not just a myth that people in impacted communities or criminals or Antifa or any of those entities bring forward. We're addressing an issue that stems from centuries of oppression that are documented and are trying to be addressed in forms like we're conducting now. So I think that's an important part of defining this oversight, is not being afraid to use those words. We know that there are problems. We are here to collaboratively find solutions. And like I said, that 1 in 12 is a national number that's not reflective intimately of Oklahoma City, but that's to be recognized as we move to reform police departments around the country.
I appreciate your feedback. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dexter Nelson.
Yes, I just had a couple of one question for clarification and then a comment. When you talk about the 1 in 12 complaints, are you specifically referring to use of force or police violence complaints, or complaints in general?
Civilian complaints.
Well, complaints against police violence or complaints in general about?
So it was a generalized formal civilian complaints. They may run the gamut in different cities on how complaints are handled, but those are 1 in 12 formalized complaints nationwide.
Okay, I'm still trying to determine. I understand formalized complaints, but at Oklahoma City, as in my department here at the university, you can complain on
so these complaints are civilian complaints against police officers. I'm not specific or direct on exactly if they were general misconduct complaints or they were actual assaults and things of that nature. My thought process tells me that they're all encompassed as civilian complaints against police officers.
Okay, so there's no clear distinction if it's just for violence or complaints in general, whether it be behavior, violence, or anything?
No.
Okay, and then the only comment I was going to make was you keep saying police violence. That term just comes across different to law enforcement. We refer to it as use of force. I know the community likes to call it violence, but anytime an officer has to use force, I guess you can refer to it as violence. Like for Oklahoma City, if you're going to handcuff someone and you have to go beyond routine handcuffing, like take them to the ground just to get the handcuffs on, we call that a use of force, where some others might call it a use of violence. The term use of force seems more palatable.
Right. So I'm going to circle around to my original statement that this is about the conversation. I'm hearing that I keep saying, when it was only a quote from Campaign Zero, not me, I don't keep saying it. I use misconduct in all my reports, but we have to understand this is that conversation that has to happen, and we can't walk on eggshells. And we have to be secure that this is the space that change starts. And we have to be open to that.
I understand. I was just trying to clarify that for law enforcement purpose, we say use of force anytime we use force, whether you would consider it violence or not. For law enforcement purpose, when you say police violence, we kind of consider that going beyond use of force and doing something illegal. So the term use of force covers everything, where for law enforcement, the term police violence is indicative of us of crossing the line and committing a crime. That's all I'll say.
And I'll concede to say we'll handle that in perception. Is that fair?
Yes, thank you very much.
Joshua Harris Teal.
My question is a simple one. We obviously, in terms of Black Lives Matter, believe that an independent monitor is the best way to create enough of a disconnect from police investigating officer-involved incidents for the community to actually trust the system a little bit more. Is that something that you would agree, in your experience that you've seen, having that independent monitor helps the community trust that the investigations are unbiased and fair?
So in fairness to the program, I'm going to put your question in the parking lot, but I will say that I do serve on the independent monitoring team in Baltimore City. So with that, I think we'll slide to the next. Any other questions we can kind of put into the parking lot, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. Is that fair? All right. So then we actually get into the types of oversight entities. And
really quick, Cherie has her hand up.
Can we parking lot her question till the end of this session, and we'll make sure we get it answered? Or is it a burning desire?
She said it's fine to push it to the end.
Thank you, Cherie. So a lot of the mechanisms we see in place are civilian review boards or complaint review boards, and usually they're kind of appointees of city districts to oversee a limited amount. I kind of highlight here DC. I highlight DCs because they kind of encompass the main task of most of these boards, and they usually have a limited amount of prowess. A lot of cities call them tigers without teeth, but DC's been around now for 20 years, and those, they handle this inappropriate language, retaliation, unnecessary or excessive force, discrimination, or a failure to identify themselves as the officers. And those are kind of repetitive of what you see in these community review boards and these entities that are chosen to oversee and review civilian complaints mostly. New York City is highlighted with their civilian complaint review board because they've gone a step further. There's a lot of legislative issues in different municipalities where a lot of that information isn't really easily accessible as far as an officer's history or past misconduct allegations and things of that nature. But New York actually has an open database where the public can actually go online, and check to see if an officer actually has an history, if this has happened before in the same communities, is there a pattern? And that's a little bit different. And of course, we in Baltimore have a civilian review board. As Ganesha said, I chaired the Civilian Oversight Task Force, which was mandated by our consent decree to make recommendations on how to have stronger civilian oversight in Baltimore City. Another aspect that people use are police monitors and independent monitors, such as the District of Columbia has an office of an auditor to kind of review the records of the officers, as well as New York. I like to use Ontario, Toronto as an example because they took it a lot further, where their review board and his director had the abilities of most mayors to hire and fire and directly implement discipline on officers. So most review boards can recommend. Some can recommend and not ever know the disposition, but Toronto could actually take it that further. And finally, police commissions. And I highlight specifically Seattle, because Seattle's police commission was mandated in their consent decree, but its effectiveness was kind of adopted by all the agencies of Seattle. And I believe 2017, it actually became part of Seattle's budget as a line item, and it's sustained as an entity that people can access to process their complaints and address issues that they have with police officers. So one thing we like to say as advocates is we take a AAA approach as we make recommendations for policies or protocols or charters or whatever that matter may be, is access, agency, and accountability. So for advocates, the first and most important piece is access. It has to be accessible to the communities that are traditionally at the brunt of these issues that we highlight with the police department. So we want to make sure that the communities that are impacted the most also have just as easy access. Agency just means sustainability. We don't want it to be an initiative or a pilot or a recommendation. We want it to be like Seattle, a sustained part of the city's process, part of their budget. And as we move forward in a spirit of reform, to ensure that this entity will still be there to serve the public and have proper funding to make it happen. And last, but of course not least, is accountability. Like I said earlier, as an advocate, you want a police department to be accountable to the communities that they serve. At the most point, that is our councilmatic districts, our wards, that direct representation that we have. So we want to make sure that there's a chain of accountability that touches and accesses the impacted communities as well. So just to overview the components usually found in the most effective oversight entities. One, it's their independence. So that falls in how they're selected, who is actually on these boards, what community or experience they actually have, and how they're connected to the process. A big piece is always funding, adequate funding. Like I said, this is about agency, and we're trying to undo a process that's over 150 years old. So it can't be done in a 6-month pilot period. We have to make sure that there's a commitment from the city to see this process out until the end. The third is access to all the critical pieces. That could mean investigatory prowess and personnel records and things of that nature, so they can actually have a more clear story of what is the foundation of this complaint, what is the background of this particular officer's rapport. The person, the entity, the board has to have that rapport with not only the police command, the police union, the city agency heads, as well as the politicians and the community. So there's a certain amount of integrity that has to be leveraged into this oversight board, as well as reputation and legitimacy. Ample authority, which is going to what I said earlier about a tiger with no teeth. So we want to make sure that whatever this entity is, there becomes this ideal of consequence or something to be accountable to. And the ability to review the policies, the trainings, and other systemic issues. So a lot of times we're dealing with issues that we know procedurally are flawed and lead to complaints and incidents of misconduct, where we want to make sure that the board can review these policies, recommend changes to the policies or the trainings that the officer get around these policies to kind of address the broader systemic issue that leads to perceived misconduct and things of that nature. Community stakeholder support and outreach. The most important part of a community review board is their connection to the people. They have to be that group that lets the community know that this is what we're doing, this is what has happened, and continue to come to us if you have these issues so we can work them out. And of course, as with any process, transparency. It has to be accessible. People need to know at all aspects what's going on. So it's not simply about dissemination of information, but this also becomes about access to information. And most of the successful oversight entities have a few of these components. But of course, as with any reform effort, there's always these common obstacles. And the first and most common is the legislative protections, things like the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, the Public Information Acts, and these things that were put in place at times when the police department was in a different place and racial relations were in a different place. And it's time to update or at least revisit some of these legislative issues that kind of preclude these issues. And we also have the issues of vague procedural policies. So they're debating right now in the trial of Derek Chauvin on was the knee on the neck police procedure to calm a situation or subdue a suspect or what, or did he go too far? And it's because those policies aren't concise enough to say, you don't do this. After a minute, after a person doesn't move, you have to get up. A big issue we find in most of these community-led efforts for oversight is the unions, the collective bargaining agreements. And I think that speaks for itself. A lot of times these relationships are complementary. So really these boards don't have investigatory prowess. They're kind of given the information. A lot of boards don't have subpoena powers, which plays a big part in ensuring that the right people come forward and talk, as well as they have access to the records that can actually prevent this type of incident from happening again. A big piece of failing oversight entities is poor collaboration. People see this agency as something separate and there isn't a collaboration to reach a common goal of reform. There's always an us versus them, Republican versus Democrat, whatever the case may be, we find that reason to not cooperate with the other entity. And the last issue is always politics, autonomy, and independence. There's always an issue of how much leverage do the politicians have in this process? How much autonomy does this board have that's been cherry-picked by this agency? How is this entity considered independent when they work under the police department or the mayor's office? And those are the issues that commonly get addressed in this process, and that becomes part of the process of creating the oversight entity that fits your city. So I'm going to pause right there, take a breath, and ask, do we have any questions?
We did have T. Cherie Dickerson hand up. Cherie, are you still there? Do you still have a question?
Thank you, MT. A lot of the information that Mr. Kelly provided answered my questions. But I am also wondering, and this was just an observation, a lot of the original comments after the first part of the presentation seemed like there was resistance or there was a problem around semantics. And so I'm wondering, is that something that you consistently have to deal with around verbiage and language? Because we've discussed before that language is important. Do you have issues with law enforcement entities not understanding how community members interpret violence, or do they just have an issue understanding what violence is overall?
Overall, everywhere I go, that's always the issue. And that's why I present that at the beginning of my presentation because I don't want law enforcement aversion to Black Lives Matter's verbiage to dissuade anyone from Black Lives Matter from speaking how they feel. So I understand that we all have different perceptions, different languages, but we are the policing task force, and our job is to find a solution. So we are the group that have to have this uncomfortable conversation. And to be blunt and concise, everywhere I go, when the officers and the public community are in the room, verbiage is an issue, and we get past it and get to the point of actual reform, change, and public safety.
Thank you for that. I'm hoping that we'll have the same resolution and results after this. I think this is why we pushed for this to actually occur. And it's very interesting, the information you presented, part of our team presented this same information around what was happening in New Orleans to the mayor early off. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Keep up the great work. We had another question, MT?
Ray, I don't see any other hands at this point, so you're free to proceed.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So I am not about recreating the wheel. I am not about not recognizing what's in place. And I always feel that the most efficient process rotates around making what we have better. So Oklahoma City currently does have a Citizens Advisory Board with, I'll say, their task is limited, but it's something that we can start on. It's something that we can build upon. Like Anisha said early on in the meeting, we have conducted a oversight subcommittee meeting, and in true format, our first task was to review what we have and to see how the components of the Citizens Advisory Board can be embellished, improved, or changed to present a more accountable mechanism for citizen complaints. So I'll just read over the 6 tasks, I'll call them, of the Citizens Advisory Board, which is review the investigative process and results of completed departmental investigation of formal citizen complaints. Review the investigative process and results of completed administrative investigations of complaints alleging excessive use of force or police brutality by a department employee. Review the investigative process and results of any other incidents involving police department employees the board seems to be of public concern. Provide comments, suggestions, and recommendations to the Chief of Police on department police procedure and rules. Provide comments, suggestions, and recommendations to the Chief of Police regarding the department's procedure for receiving, investigating, and reviewing citizen complaints. Convene or attend public forums to establish an exchange with the community. Members of the community will be encouraged to express concerns or approval regarding the actions of the police department and request information on Citizen Advisory Board activities. So that's what we have right now in Oklahoma City. I personally say that this is broad and can be interpreted many different ways. And I see a lot of review without recommendation, but I definitely see the foundation, and I'll kind of leave that to the second piece with the subject matter experts more so, but there's plenty to build upon with the Citizens Advisory Board. I can't speak on what they're executing right now or what their track record is, but language-wise, there's a lot to build on. So like I said, I'm not a fan of tearing it down and starting over when there's a strong foundation underneath. And like I said, I'm not here to make recommendations at this point, but I was always taught to be cognizant of what you have. And I think I'll end my presentation there. Like I said, there's always an opportunity to get involved. Ganesha is going to send out the information on when the subcommittees meet, and I'll also have information with links on a lot of the advisory boards that I discussed today. If you want to reach out to me, here's my email where you can just reach out to me if you just want to talk about it, or you wanted some clarity on a certain situation, or even just know my own experience and what obstacles we've run into in Baltimore City and how our drive for accountability in Baltimore City is moving forward. So I want to just end it right there. If anyone has any questions.
Ray, we do have a question from Sarah Adams Cornell.
I'm ready.
Sarah, are you there?
Yeah, I see her hand, but it looks like, oh, there she is. No, that's not her. Maybe we can circle back around.
Yeah,
Oh,
we're gonna have
okay.
another opportunity of questions with the panel, correct?
I do have another hand up, Joshua Higginbotham.
Yes. So one of the questions I had, we had a presentation about the Citizens Oversight Board earlier in this process. And one of the requirements that I think everyone kind of felt was a little bit odd was that you had to be a property owner in Oklahoma City proper to actually be on the board. I wanted to know how common that is among the oversight boards that you've worked with.
Not very. It's more a residency issue. And most boards, you have to reside in the ward or councilmatic district where you accept a nomination. I think that's something that, if the case is that you have to be a homeowner or a property owner, that's something that this task force should be revisiting.
Yeah, Ray, this is Craig Freeman. I was going to mention too, and I was going to check with the chief, or I think I saw Mannix Barnes on here too, who's actually on the advisory board. I don't believe that property ownership is a requirement. Is that correct, Chief?
That is correct. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but it's basically that you have an interest in the city. And I don't even think you have to actually live in the city, but you have to be employed or work in the city. There has to be some kind of interest there. The term property ownership is not in there. And I can look up the exact verbiage.
Yeah, and to Ray's point, it's something we're glad to revisit and look at. You know, if our terminology is misleading, or someone could interpret it that way, we could definitely revisit that. And then also, I think, just taking to that point of should we have a residency requirement, I think it's a good question for us to ask.
Yeah, Craig, I think what it requires is you either have to work in the Oklahoma City area or have a job that, whether it's a nonprofit or anything like that, that is within city limits, but you don't have to reside in Oklahoma City.
Okay.
We also have a hand up from Corey, our interpreter.
Yes, this is Rachel, and the interpreter is speaking for me. So I had a question about Baltimore. In that area, I know there's a big deaf community, and I'm wondering if you have any experience with the deaf community or any disability groups that have used different languages. What is your experience with that?
So I think in all of our process in Baltimore, there's a mandated interpretation into Spanish, as well as all public functions have to have a sign language interpreter. We do work with discipline, what are they called? Disability Rights Maryland, and they kind of ensure that we are inclusive of all of the disadvantaged communities with this messaging that we put forward on our consent decree.
Okay, before I move any further forward with other hands, I do see Sarah Adams Cornell. Sarah, do you still have a question?
Thank you, MT. I want to thank you, Ray, for your presentation. That last slide that talked about our oversight committee, and I agree, it looks like there's a lot of review and that there are suggestions made, but there's not any teeth, so to speak, about making sure that changes happen. With your experience in Baltimore, how are you addressing that, or are you seeing change in that way? Because it seems as though a group of people should be able to say and see results from recommendations about how they are overseen by police. And just wondering what your experience is.
So as I tried to point out, most of the review boards are what we call those toothless tigers, where if it's blatant or something like that, that's not really what the review board handles. So the incidents that the community goes to are always kind of the ones that are brushed to the side. There's a lot of issues with legislation that kind of blocks personnel records from being exposed, and a lot of information, because of charters and laws that were written, have to be, for lack of a better term, didacted and passed along to a review board, because they're not sworn officers investigating crimes or anything of that nature. And I think that's, a lot of these boards were created as an accommodation to the communities following a war on drugs. So we had this whole era of zero tolerance, and the communities rose up, and we kind of moved into a different type of addressing addiction and things of that nature. And we created these review boards to make sure that that zero tolerance broken windows type of policing wasn't still happening. But now, as we evolve into actual reform, that language has to shift to okay, this is not what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to move forward. So it's common. It happens a lot with newer review boards and smaller less recognized review boards in the cities. But like I said, there's always the opportunity to change and revisit language. That, I mean, you can change 2 words. You change review and a lot of those duties of the Civilian Review Board into straight recommendation power, and then it's a whole different document. So I think that's how we build on what we have.
And if I'm,
Ray.
oh, sorry, thank you, Sarah. If I may take a personal point of privilege and just ask the group a question. So we have invited some guests to be our, to talk about their actual experience on the ground. One of the people is from New Orleans, and I know that there's people on the call that specifically, really like that model. And so if I could ask, and I want to be respectful of their time, Ray is a resource that you all can reach out to at any point, and have several conversations with. If it's okay for people who absolutely want to ask the question now, keep your hand up. But if not, if it's okay with you, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the panel, so that we can hear from these folks who have actually been on the call since the beginning, and will be spending 2 hours of their time with us today. Let them speak, let you ask them questions, and then open the floor back up. I think, Sheree, I see your hand is still up. And so if you need to ask your question, go ahead, and then I will move forward in introducing our panelists.
Ganesha, I'll yield my question. I do want to point out, I know that Garland, and he's been driving, but since early on, since the first presentation, he's been trying to make a comment, but I don't think he could raise his hand because he was driving.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that.
Mr. Pruitt, are you still wanting to make a comment, or can we move on with the presentation on the panel?
Well, before the panel gets started, they can possibly end up intervening on that particular question I had. With this review board that you have in Baltimore, do they have subpoena power? Do they have investigatory power? And the reason I asked that question, because if I'm on the review board and I got a question or a concern and it's not being addressed by the police department, what are my resources, or what is my outlet in order to get additional information in order to get my needs met when it comes to, like I said, subpoena power or investigative power?
So as I said in the beginning and on multiple, that subpoena power and law enforcement officers' bills of rights, public information acts, there's a lot of obstacles. I don't know the specific obstacles in Oklahoma City that you guys have to come, but every city has charter issues and things of that nature. As far as Baltimore, no, we don't have subpoenas. That's something that our Civilian Review Board still fights for, is subpoena rights. And I think just last night, they repealed our law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. So that's been, for me, a 12-year fight that just happened after 12 years. And it's worked. It has to start. There has to be a foundation. There is no panacea. There's no silver bullet. Every city got to put in that work to get there.
Okay, Ganesha, I think at this point, we're free to go on with the panel.
Thank you, MT, and thank you, Ray, for your presentation. So you all, I'm going to read, I won't read the whole bios because they're extensive, but they're great, just to show you that we've tried to get the best people possible before you, so that you can be educated as you move towards your recommendation. So as was mentioned earlier, we have Mr. Mannix Barnes on the call. I know you all had a presentation with him before. He has been on the board, is my understanding, from its inception. And so he was definitely, he's, longtime Oklahoma resident and very active in several different areas. He is going to be here to answer any questions that you may have about the current state of the advisory board. In addition, we have Mr. Brian Core. I hope I'm saying your name right. I apologize if I'm not. Mr. Core is the immediate past president of NACOL and has worked for the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts since 2008, where he leads both the city's Police Review and Advisory Board and its Peace Commission. He manages Cambridge's Civilian Oversight Agency, as well as community responses to support recovery and healing in the wake of traumatic events and violence affecting Cambridge and its residents. Elected 3 times as NACOL's president from 2016 to 2019, Brian has served on the board of directors since 2012 and as vice president in 2013-2014. I do want, for those who are not familiar, I am going to just tell you what NACOL is and advocate that you actually look them up. But it's the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Their mission is to create a community of support of independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities that they serve. Also, we have on the panel, Mrs. Susan Houston, or Hudson, excuse me, the independent police monitor in New Orleans. The city of New Orleans has welcomed Susan Hudson as the independent police monitor as of June 2010. Prior to accepting the position in New Orleans, she worked at the Los Angeles Police Commission's Office of the Inspector General as an assistant inspector general and as acting police monitor at the Office of the Police Monitor in Austin. Prior to working in police oversight, she was a general practitioner, defense counsel, prosecutor, and assistant city attorney handling labor matters. She holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Penn and a JD from Tulane. She was elected to a two-term as the president of NACOL in September of 2019 as past president of the International Law Enforcement Auditors Association. We welcome you, and I will ask Mr. Core to kick us off. I've asked that they do a presentation about their experience. We will go down the line and then we will turn it over to you all for questions. Brian, are you there? Oh.
He's not muted, but his microphone isn't picking up audio.
Okay, well, while we work through that, thank you, Josh. While we work through that, Ms. Hudson, do you mind starting us off?
Okay, let me check in. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much, Kenesha. Thank you, Ray, for inviting me. I also want to let you know that also on this call is Gia Orlando. It says a second Susan Hudson, but it's actually my friend Gia. She was at the Office of the Independent Monitor in Denver, which handles the jail and police oversight. You had the wrong address for her, so I just forwarded that to her today, and graciously she was able to join us. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Excited about the journey you're on, and any information I can give you. We at NACOL and as the independent police monitor in New Orleans, I'm glad to help our sister city get where you need to get. You had asked us to give you a little bit of information about our agencies and then our struggles and challenges and what's worked well. I'm going to tell you 3 things. Accountability. We're always accountable to our community. Transparent. We do not hold secrets for our police department. Our job is to get the information out there. And then we are community led and not community oriented or community whatever. Community led. We do what our community asks us to do. And we try to bring as many parts of our community together as we can to work out dialogue. So whether conservative or liberal or libertarian, whatever it may be, we think there's a place for everybody at the table to talk. Now, our particular model in New Orleans is as you can see, a police monitor. And so we can monitor events as they're ongoing. So if there's an officer involved shooting or an in custody death, we roll out to the scene, we monitor those investigations. We do not have investigatory powers over most use of force or complaints. Our investigatory power is under state law, and that is only for secondary employment. So our job is to see how the police police themselves. So we investigate the investigations of the police. We do it the exact same way every time. We use standards that came from the consent decree in Los Angeles, where I got those standards from. So they hold up to DOJ standards when DOJ comes in to help provide technical assistance or to correct other departments that have gone astray. So that's what we do here. We can also review cases afterwards. We also audit. But one of our biggest functions is to provide community, to be between our community and police officers who are also a part of our community. Sometimes the dialogue breaks down and we have to be there to be that bridge between them. For example, during the tear gas incident this summer, we only had one, but that incident sparked a whole wave of change and the banning of tear gas and a number of things. And we helped to be between our police department and the community on reworking the policy, well, actually creating the policy. So those are some of the things that we try to do because we do believe in community-led policing. Our structure itself is pretty independent. Our funding is in the charter. Our authority is in the charter. So it can't go anywhere unless our community votes to get rid of us. We got that true independence in 2016, as many other cities around this country did as well. So that charter strength and authority is super important, and the ability to hold the funding. Whoever holds the funding also holds the voice and all the other work of this agency. So having that independent funding is super important. We have an independent voice. It is our job to put that information out there. And whereas before the office attained true independence, I could be fired for doing my job and speaking out, then there was now insulation between the police monitor's office and any political function. So our offices, we have ethics entities which sit outside of the city's political structure. I can talk to you more about that offline, or if you need more information on that, but it allows for a lot of independence. It allows for us to have an independent voice and to really interact with our community and not be afraid to do that. So taking up a lot of time there, but this is my third oversight agency in a third state. I like this one the best, but I'm glad to answer any questions as that comes up. So I'll turn the mic back over to you, Denisha.
Thank you. And should we have
can you hear me? Okay.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, perfect.
Up to whatever you want to do. I just wanted to make sure I was back.
You are definitely back. Let me ask Ms. Hudson, should we go to Ms. Hudson second? I missed that name. I apologize. Before.
Yeah, that's Gia Orlando from Denver, and however y'all want to do it, but I think she's mic'd up and ready.
Go ahead. Yeah, Gia, why don't you go ahead, if that's all right.
We love Gia. Gia is like one of my original influencers.
Okay.
Is that a good thing, Ray?
That means that you get blamed for everything that I do.
Yeah, I figured. I'm proud of that. So my name is Giannina Orlando. I'm in Denver, Colorado. I have worked for the Office of the Independent Monitor for close to 7 years, and was primarily responsible for oversight of a team of outreach people that, let the community and other stakeholders know about what we did and how to access our services. In that, we actually were able to run some really good programming in the community and get to know a lot of community members that traditionally wouldn't have sought our services until they needed them. But we did proactive, kids and cops work and other things that just made it, a really good model for oversight stakeholder engagement. I also am working with now I'm actually not working in the Office of the Independent Monitor, and I'm doing some consulting around community and stakeholder engagement in California as well as in Colorado. So that's my background. I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of community engagement. Ray said it really well. You don't have a good oversight model until you actually have a really good, strong community backing. When I say community, I mean all pieces of the community, right? So law enforcement's part of the community, your elected officials are part of the community, and especially impacted people have to be part of the community going forward. And you know, just as soon as you get there, doesn't mean that they don't need to do any more work, right? The community has to come along with you. They have to understand everything about your model. They have to understand the constriction that you're under. They have to understand how to support you when you don't feel like you have enough teeth, and they have to be able to go and talk to their representatives and get power out of the system to support the oversight model once it's independent. The other part of the experience that I had in Denver, which I think is super, super important, is making sure that you actually have a really good policy team, people that are really looking at trends and patterns around, you know, when the same thing is happening 2 and 3 times in a couple of months, that you're actually looking and saying, well, maybe we need to change that policy or retrain some officers, right? So you want to make sure that you have some policy availability, whether it's through a board or whether it's actually through people that will actually, you know, regularly review your policies and how those policies are actually helping you. And then third, I would say that you really need to just have adequate legislation. Legislation, even though everybody doesn't want to look at oversight as a political entity, it really is in a lot of ways a political entity, because you're working with other city agencies, and your legislation and your authority is utmost importance to everything that you do, right? If you're not independent and you don't have good legislation that allows you access to everything, you're actually not very viable. So make sure that you actually really work with your elected officials and the community to make sure that you have plenty of good legislation that allows you access. And then as you're building through this, just think about how any agency or organization evolves. And it usually starts with an idea that they think is going to work the right way, and that you have to then visit, you know, every couple of years to see if it needs to be tweaked, right? So as you think about legislation, also think about putting a piece of, you know, of evaluation in there, whether it's 3 years, like one organization that I know which works really well, or 5 years, or through a process that's, you know, a planning process that happens, you know, once every 10. You just have to make sure that there's room for you to always go back and tweak the model so that it gives the community and the stakeholders what they need at any given time. And I'll stop there. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, so I want to make sure and leave some time for that. Brian, if you want to go.
Okay, all right, thank you, Gia. So there's been so much information. I kind of had some points I wanted to make, but I'm going to skip a lot of them because I think people have made them and they'll come up in questions. So I guess one thing, just so people know, is I work in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, city of about 150,000 people, right next to Boston. So it's not exactly a college town or a suburb. It's not exactly urban. And we have basically a review model. It started as an investigative model in the 1980s, and we still have investigative powers. I've had to do a couple of investigations in a couple specific cases, but mostly we work as a review board. One thing that we do, which I say we put us in the hybrid field, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment, is that we also can make recommendations about policy and procedures. That's not very common for review boards. Most review boards really are just reviewing investigations. So it's an interesting mix of things I do. And that brings me to a couple things I just want to add on to what Ray talked about in terms of models. In the world of NACOL, we generally look at 3 basic models. There's the review focus model, an investigation focus model, which sort of speaks for itself, and then monitors, auditors, inspectors general. Really, those models are looking at broader issues, not just individual complaints, but really looking at systematic issues. And then increasingly what we've seen are hybrid models. I mean, the model that Susan just talked about in New Orleans is a good example of a hybrid of some of these different pieces. And I haven't spent a ton of time looking at your current model, but it actually, I do think that you have a lot to build on. So take heart in terms of that. And the other piece I just want to kind of circle back to is, I want to give you NACOL's definition. Now, this is not something we've all voted on and agreed, but this is what we generally say at NACOL. That civilian oversight in the US is any system or entity that investigates, audits, or reviews internal law enforcement investigations or processes, including citizen complaints and use of force incidents. It can conduct ongoing monitoring of law enforcement agencies' policies, procedures, training, and management supervision practices. And we include any agency or procedure that involves active participation in those couple of things I mentioned by people who are not sworn officers. So there are civilian oversight agencies in our world that are basically an internal affairs department that is led by a civilian and staffed partially by civilians, partially by sworn staff. So I could go into a lot of detail, but I just want to say that you should all know that there's a huge range of things that you can pick and choose from to create the model that works for Oklahoma City. So, you know, we're a resource, obviously. You've got great resources with 21st century solutions, 21st century CP. So there's a lot that you have in front of you, and we can help you with that as well. The last general thing I just want to say is about my own philosophy in this work. You know, we are in a moment, as we all know, where the tensions are huge in our society for all sorts of reasons. There's a reckoning around race. We're watching, at least many of us, the Derek Chauvin trial happen in real time. And so in this time, we really have to be intentional about creating something that, as Gia said, involves all stakeholders. And there are lots of good reasons to focus on activism and sort of what people tend to refer to as community. But I would say that for oversight to be successful, everybody has to have a seat at the table. And that's one of the things I'm very impressed about this task force, is you have a range of stakeholders at the table involved in those discussions. And that's how you get things to be sustainable. That's how you create a system that people understand what it is and how it works. Because people will often tell you that oversight has failed here, there, everywhere. And what I always say is that oversight has often failed to meet expectations. So you will have an important role in helping your community, all parts of your community, understand what kind of oversight is created in Oklahoma City so that people have realistic expectations. That is one of the key things I've learned in this work, is there's got to be that constant dialogue so people understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and reporting is very, very key for all of that. The last big general point I want to talk about is procedural justice and legitimacy. This has come up a lot. Obviously, there are people right here on this in this meeting that know more about it than me because they served on the President's 21st Century Task Force. But I always say that procedural justice and legitimacy are just as important for oversight. And in fact, it might be a little harder for us because we have to have legitimacy with all of the stakeholders, with Black Lives Matter, with law enforcement, with community members who think that the police are amazing and never do anything wrong, and with people who have suffered at the hands of law enforcement in your community or some other community, or heard the stories, or have the history of their family. So as we do that work, it's very important that everybody has a voice, everybody is heard, and at the same time, we have to remember why we're here. And I think Ray put it very well, that the reason we have oversight, I think the history is a little more complicated in a lot of different ways, but we have it because things have gone wrong. And the last point is that when people are doing the work of oversight, they have to be fair and impartial. I mean, back to procedural justice and legitimacy. For whatever you create to be legitimate, people have to be able to trust that you've got their best interests at heart, that you're doing what you're doing, not because the law gave you the authority to do it, but because it's the right thing to do and you're taking care of your community. So I've a thousand things I'd love to say, but I will stop, and really any questions, I'm happy to try to answer as they come up.
Thank you. Mannix, do you have anything that you'd like to say, or would you like to we can just jump right on into questions?
We can go ahead and jump into questions.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, we have a lot of brain power with us today, you all, and let's take advantage of it. Let's start with asking the question. So, MT, I see some hands already raised over there.
Yes, we do have two hands raised, and I want to also encourage participation in this and asking of questions, especially from those who may not have commented before. You know, this task force is going to be asked to make some recommendations, and I think we all need to be take advantage of your thoughts as well as those that generally talk all the time. So with that in mind, the first hand I have up is Joshua Harris Teal.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. I'm sure Josh Higginbotham is going to speak later about Hudson and the fact that we pulled your model when we first had the conversation, the New Orleans model, based on this governmental structure. So I'm sure Josh will touch in on that. I have 3 questions. I imagine I can't ask all 3 questions, but what I will do is say, because they were for 3 different people. And so if we need to come back, just let me know, whatever you want, MT. They're pretty quick and concise and for each one of the points that you guys made. First, to Ms. Hudson, why or what are the arguments against independent monitors? That kind of seems to be a no-brainer to me, but obviously this is a contentious issue. So like, if you have some insight on that for Ms. Gloria, with no access to legislative change, is this entire push for police accountability pointless or dead on arrival? And then for Mr. I forgot his name, the gentleman that just spoke.
Mr. Brian.
Brian, I apologize. You speak from what seems to be a very optimistic standpoint. And I think I 100% agree with you in terms of having credibility in all across a bunch of communities. I feel like I have personally built a lot of this credibility across multiple communities, representing Black Lives Matter, speaking with the mayor and MT on a number of different issues, speaking with the faith leaders on it. But the reality is there is an inability to convince people who don't want to be convinced the need for some of this change. And the pushback that I get from so many people in the community is, you know, what's the point of what you're doing? And I'm not really having a good enough answer on how to continue pushing for a process such as this task force. So I'm sorry, there's 3 different questions for 3 different people. MT, however you want to navigate that, you're in charge. My apologies again. I just kind of wanted to get them all out.
Well, first, let's go ahead with your first question. I think that was directed at Susan.
Yes.
And that question was, what are some of the arguments against oversight?
Yes, and the independent monitor in particular.
There were some arguments about, well, when I'll talk to you about just in general, there was about, is it necessary, the funding for it? Can't the police just do their own internal accountability functions, which we obviously did not happen here in New Orleans. And so that was just a no-brainer no. But then when we needed independence here, because this city had been through change where it had had prior offices that looked at the police and could investigate them deeply and so on and so forth. But because they lacked independence, they disappeared. They stopped funding them, they stopped hiring for them. And so those just all disappeared. So the need for a true independent police monitor and one that was built into the charter so that it could not be removed or defunded was something that was the experience of this community. They knew that this has happened before. Now, it also came up about as a part of a good governance kind of push after Hurricane Katrina, when just kind of the entire city got laid bare for corruption, so on and so forth. So an inspector general was also created to stop fraud, waste, and abuse. And there was also an ethics review board created. So it was a part of a bigger package of just better governance. And so that's how we were able to kind of overcome this is too much money or the police can look out for themselves type of thing. Did that kind of answer your question, what you were looking for?
Okay. Great. And mine, I think, was for about legislation. Is that correct? Why the need for legislation?
No, so I understand the need for legislative change in terms of creating sustainable progress or oversight. But if we just don't have access to legislative change, the unfortunate reality is our state legislature just doesn't have a focus on these kind of issues and aren't necessarily open to conversations like them. I've done a lot of work in legislative politics on both sides of the aisle. And I just know that there's no way we're going to get anything that appears to be restrictions on police officers through the legislature?
So I primarily was talking about local jurisdictions and the legislation that you get through like Oklahoma City, right? While I was at Denver, we went through 3 different legislative processes in 6 years. So we first went after an ordinance change that allowed us to have access to documents before they could be Freedom of Information Act requested out. Like we had newspapers that were getting documents before we were getting documents. And so we clarified that. And then we went after a charter amendment that actually put us in the charter and put us with the other safety organizations. In Denver, there's a sheriff and a police department that put us in the same place as the other safety organizations through charter. And then we went through a final one that really clarified a lot of the problems that we were having, being able to access what we needed to take care of the work that we were doing. So what I actually put out there is pay attention to the legislation, definitely get to know the legislation. But after George Floyd's death and the protests that happened, there were like 23 states within 6 months that had passed legislation or had legislation pending on police officer conduct. So I don't think you have to take it upon yourself. I think it's a question of the community really understanding and knowing what is up against them, and then using their power and incidents that happen to actually change that legislation. You are the people that actually get them elected, and also the people that replace them. And if there's enough of you working on that, you can get to the state level. But I was primarily talking about working at the local level to make sure that you had all the legislation you needed to fulfill your mission.
Okay, if at all possible, everyone, one question at a time. And just to give everybody a chance to get in there. And Garland, I do see your hand up, but I have some other people that were in before you. So I'm going to go now to Joshua Higginbotham.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here. And also, Ms. Hudson, I'm a big fan. I've read a lot of the stuff that you worked on, and working in conjunction with a couple of professors, is how we kind of chose the model to present to the mayor first week in June. My question is a little more general, kind of for everyone. I have seen some cities specifically that are going for, either in the process now or have gone for before, trying to collapse either an independent model, civilian oversight board or something, and the internal affairs departments of police to make sure that it's housed outside of the police department, so that which actually kind of, it appears at least to strengthen those boards or those independent monitors, and wanted to know what you all thought about that, or if you'd had any experience in your cities or other cities with that process.
I guess maybe I can just start and just say very quickly, we don't have a model like that in Cambridge, but I think the one that always comes to mind is Seattle, where a number of years ago, they put a civilian director in charge of the Office of Professional Accountability. And initially it was inside the police department still. They eventually moved the office out of the police department, hired a mix of civilian and sworn staff to do investigations and work. So that has been, I think, a successful model. Now, again, Seattle, there's a whole range of oversight going on. It's a very complicated environment, but there are definitely models like that where that's worked. And there's similar models in Canada. The OIPRD in Ontario that Ray mentioned, that they have very similar models where you have civilian entities that do investigations.
Okay, next up is Joanne Davis.
Thank you, and I appreciate everybody. I just have one question for those of you all who are presenting today. Is there a format to present any data relative to what you review and then any subsequent changes? Stats tell the story, data tells the story. So how do you determine whether or not you've met any objective if there's no trackability? And if there is, can you kind of discuss that?
Panel, did you all understand that question? Joanne, it sounds like you might be moving your head back and forth from your mic. Would you repeat again?
Yeah, I was just asking, do you track your changes or any recommendations and then thus changes? Data tells the story. So do the review boards typically have a process that tracks what they do and when those changes are done and any impact accordingly?
Absolutely. So you can actually go onto the Office of the Independent Monitor in Denver, Colorado. It's denvergov.org, Office of the Independent Monitor. And we have reports going back to the start of our organization, back to 2005. 2006, I think, were the first reports. But as Brian said, reporting is actually a really important part of what any agency does, right? You keep track of the number of complaints, the types of complaints against what kinds of officers. You really pay attention to the trends and patterns that come out of that data aggregation and reporting. And that's how you actually get to the policy issues in the first place, right? You have to actually understand the state of the policies through the complaint process to be able to change the policies and retrain people for better policies that work better for the people on the ground.
Okay, at this point, Garland, I'm going to let you jump in there, then I've got others after you.
Yes, Gina, you're in Colorado. Didn't Colorado just they did away with the qualified immunity?
We did, although I have to tell you that it's a little bit of a mask. So the legislature is currently in session now, and they're trying to get rid of all of it, but they got rid of up to 5% is what they really did. So they made the officers actually have to eat 5% if the city ate 95% of anything that came down. So it didn't get, it didn't go away. It just made the officers somewhat personally responsible if they were actually taken to court and found guilty of a crime that had financial consequences. Although I did just hear that another state totally took it away, and I think it's New York. Was it New York or New Jersey that took qualified immunity away? Yeah, there you go.
New York.
And that was just this week, I think.
Yesterday.
I think personally that anything less than something in that vein, I think we're not going to be successful. Until you can hold somebody accountable, a lot of times, we have a tendency to just ignore it and carry on, and the band plays on. I think with these particular meetings that we're having, that I think it would be to our advantage. Just an example, from the time that we've been conceived as a task force to right now, have died in our city since that point. And we need to update that every meeting that we have, just to see and show that if there's no new policy or no new law put in place, we have exactly what we started with. And so accountability is everything. I'm interested in what New York did, and I'm interested in, the young man said a little earlier that we have some work to be put in. I think the task force is formed for us to be able to put that work in and get there a lot quicker than it took them to get there.
Garland, I'm going to shut you off at this point and ask for the next speaker or question. Valerie Thompson.
Yes, thank you, MT. And I think sometimes Joanne Davis and I are both on the same page, because my question has to do with data and accountability as well. But first, I want to also thank the guests and thank everyone from that are our guests that are joining us today. The information has been really great, and I appreciate the presentations. I am particularly looking forward to the town hall next week, only because Oklahoma City is a very diverse community. So my question is, how has other communities done this, and how will 21CP really capture the data that we will get from the town hall, and how will that information be shared with the task force?
So your question is actually for 21CP?
Actually, my question is for the guests that have presented. How have they, in their community forums, in their community meetings, how have they captured that information, from the community? And then also, I guess I'm a little curious on how 21CP thinks that that will be shared here with our task force?
You know, again, I can just say something very quickly and brief. So one of the places that NACOL's been working with is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Might sound a little random, but they have been pushing forward for oversight. And it was led by their Black Lives Matter group, the Alliance for Social Justice. So they worked with NACOL and the city, the three entities, to do community outreach, which includes surveys, and also a number of focus groups, which were very interesting because it gave a chance to different people from the community to, you know, we did all by Zoom. So to get on Zoom and talk about their issues. They had a number of questions. So between those two things, they were able to get, you know, feedback written, but also feedback in these sort of sessions that, you know, we've adapted in the world of COVID. So I guess the main point is just trying to figure out multiple ways to reach different groups of people, you know, doing it through faith communities and all the people who are not the ones who are like us, who get on Zoom all day long.
If I could just jump in there too, because I've seen a couple of things that I think have worked out really well in terms of getting community input, because there's so many different aspects of policing that people focus on. You've got qualified immunity, you've got police officer Bill of Rights laws, you've got investigating or subpoena power. There are just a number of issues that people look at. What we've been able to do around COVID policing here is just have a network of people who, and we meet every other Tuesday, I believe it is, to just go over whatever issues we have and collect them, and people can put forward whatever those issues are. So one of the things we put forward is a public-facing database of misconduct and use of force and other policing data, and we get community input about that. We've got community input about what it should look like, what the data should be, so on and so forth. So that's been really good. If you get a chance to, I watched some YouTube videos from Arlington, Virginia, as they're trying to reimagine policing, reimagine oversight, all aspects of public safety for everyone. And they realize it's more than just the police and it's more than the oversight agency. It takes them all. And so they broke up into different groups. I think there were 4 or 5 of them. Police were a part of those groups. And then they just reimagined it and came back to the city manager with all these recommendations for change. They really included a great deal of community input about what public safety should look like for all. So I thought that was just amazing. I'm trying to do that here as well.
Mr. Berry, if I could just add a little bit to that, you know, as an outreach person for the, you know, my entire career, I would just say that it's really, really important to have adequate resources, because the thing that actually gets forgotten most of the time when you're actually putting together an oversight agency is an adequate outreach team, right? You want people to actually have the skills to facilitate those meetings. You want people to actually be passionate about what they do and have good feet in the community that can bring people out and also make sure that they're capturing things correctly and that the feedback gets back to the people who it needs to get back to. And that all happens because you actually fund that team and make sure that they're well trained to do the work that they need to do. Nobody comes looking for oversight until they're impacted.
So, and that's actually a perfect setup, Dr. Thompson, to hit on a couple of things. So, you know, one, and this is, a lot of this is emanated from, you know, you giving me some contacts. So one, I'm going to get this wrong, but the Promises Tomorrow, or Promising Tomorrow, the school for homeless young people, we are going to have a listening session with them, which is like a focus group. And what they're doing is they're opening their doors. They are using a conference room. They're using their offices, and they're inviting in the families so that those folks who do not have access can be there and give their input. We continue. I just spoke with Jabbar earlier this week. One of the things that we're going to do is try to put together a listening session with someone out of the New York office that has social justice issues for the Urban League, and have something where specifically the community is talking about oversight issues. What I see for the town hall on Monday, while this group is focused on 2 issues and the working group is focused on 6 issues, we are going to let people at that town hall talk about whatever they want to. However they feel about policing. What we generally do is we capture that in notes, we put them in categories, and we hope to take their input and the input from the task force and the working group and all of the listening sessions that we're having, and hope that what comes out are actually recommendations that are reflective of best practices nationally, and also what the citizens of Oklahoma want to see.
Okay, any other questions? I have no hands raised.
I see Brian's hand just raised.
Yeah, I want to be polite, but there was a question from Joshua Harris Till, so I will be brief again. But you asked how I seem so optimistic, and I am optimistic. I spent decades working as an activist. Right before I came to the city of Cambridge, I was the organizing director for the state of Massachusetts for the ACLU. So I mean, I come to this work out of that background, but I really believe in the inside-outside strategy about everything. So my role here is to be inside the system, working to make things better. And then the advocates, the ACLU of Massachusetts, is still out there pushing Cambridge every day. So I believe that, all of us working together in our different roles can really make positive change happen. So it's challenging, but don't lose heart and know that the work that people are doing in the streets, combined with the work that people are doing inside City Hall, will make things better for people. Thank you.
Okay, Mannix, any questions or anything you want to say?
No, I'm ready to take any questions that anybody may have with regard to our Citizens Advisory Committee, if I can help in any way on letting everyone know what we do and how we deal with different issues in the community, as well as cases that we go over. So.
Anyone? I do see some hands now. Ray Kelly.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on what Brian said. And I think that's a real important piece of this. And I come from a different perspective than most. And I've learned over the years that optimism is necessary when you're actually advocating for real change. And like I said earlier, it's been since 2012, I've been advocating in Baltimore for a law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights repeal. So this type of work is essentially undoing racism, and it's going to take time. There's nothing we're going to post on Facebook or Twitter. There's nothing that we're going to write as recommendations to this task force, and there's nothing that this task force is going to submit to the city that's actually going to change that culture immediately. It's going to take a continued effort. Like Gia said, you have to keep leaving that opportunity to make it better and tweak it up a little bit. And I think that's a key component to getting this type of reform work done, is committing to the process. So, I mean, we can only think back 175 years ago, where who would have thought that we would even be in a meeting with the city talking about us overseeing the police. So it takes time, and this is like the actual work of undoing the impact of racism over all of these centuries.
Thanks, Ray. Do we have any other questions now in regards to the panelists and anything for the panelists? Sarah Adams Cornell.
I'm ready to get going and revamp our Citizens Advisory Board. Let's do that. What are the first steps that you would recommend that we take to start that work?
Well, I think you're taking it right now, correct? Like, this is a task force that's set up for a reimagining of oversight. Is that correct? So that's first. And then secondly, I would say you really, really, really have to get more community involved. So each of you should be able to reach 10 others that you're keeping, up to date on everything that's happening. There should be plenty of media when you come out with your recommendations, and people should really, understand, what it looks like to actually have an oversight agency that's looking out for them. If you're going to be able to take complaints in your office, and people that have just had a bad interaction with an officer can come to a civilian instead of going to internal affairs, right, to complain. I mean, you're going to want to do accessibility. So that if that means making sure that there's paper brochure stands in 60 different community organizations, hospitals, and elected officials' offices, then that's how you do things. You go back to the old school stuff, and you make sure that you have a paper presence until, you've got a sense of whether or not people know that you exist. And you would just keep evaluating yourselves. You evaluate the model, you evaluate the work, you evaluate who's involved, and make everything transparent.
I'm sorry, Gia, let me be a little bit more specific. What is the office that controls that advisory board, who we need to go to and start having those conversations?
So I'm so sorry that I don't know anything more about your structure right now. My assumption is that you're looking for a revamp of whatever you have at this time, and that chances are good you probably will end up with some staff. Do you have staff now for your board?
You're talking about the Citizens Advisory Board, correct?
Yes.
Okay, basically, we're an independent group. We don't answer to the police department or anybody. We work for the community. To me, before you start thinking about revamping, everybody needs to know exactly what we do and where we started from. When we first started, we were basically just given a review, basically a piece of paper of each case, and that was it. And we demanded more information. I mean, this has been a process over several years, and we had worked with community leaders like Garland, like Milt Combs, and several other folks on helping try to get this done. But we went from that to actually being able to get pictures of the incident. So for instance, if an officer said, hey, this gentleman hit me in the face, well, we wanted to see pictures of that to find out, was there marks on the policeman, or was there marks on the victim, or whatever. We finally got that done, but a lot of that takes, a year or two, because you're having to go back and forth with the FOP and so on to try to get all of this done. Then we wanted files. So that everybody objected to that. We wanted to look at the investigative file. We wanted to go through all of that. And a lot of that had officers' names. So first thing you know, they took that away from us and said, can't do that. Well, then we negotiated, or the chief at the time, to get that back in place. And that was help to our community leaders like Garland that helped work with the chief and get that back in place to where we could go through all the investigative files and look at the complete investigation that they did. Then it went to videos. We had to fight for videos. So this has been a process for several years to get where we're at. And I know a lot of people like to say, oh, they're just not doing anything. Well, if they're saying that, then they don't really know what we're doing. And we're open. I've taken calls from several different people, and they'll tell you that. And we answered. There was one that was given to me just, I guess it's probably 3 months ago or so. And we've got that up for review at our next meeting. We've asked for video. We've asked for different things because there was a person who's got hit with a door of a police car as they were putting him inside. We want to look at that video. We want to look at the complete file. So these are things that people don't see, and we can't really invite a lot in there because we're dealing with people's personnel files. Yeah. So it's not open.
So I apologize for actually assuming that you guys were looking to revamp. I didn't have any background on any of this and found out that I was invited literally 45 minutes before I started speaking. Like I got on 15 minutes late to the call. So I apologize for that. In that vein, though, to answer your question, it sounds to me like you need authority, independence, and funding, and community perspective on really how this needs to serve the community.
It would help, and we've even got to the point to where we're taking a lot of the use of force files, because there's so many of them that they have to look at, and then we're basically volunteers of the community. Our time's limited too, And so we have to take what cases we think are pretty important. I think all of them are important, but you can only review so many. And we're talking about videos. And the best thing to me that's ever happened since I've been on this board is the body worn cameras. This has helped us tremendously to get through a lot of these complaints. And there's some that are valid, but there's a lot that are not once we see the body worn cameras. And so, and that's something our board has pushed for a long time, because again, there was a lot of officers that were objecting to body worn cameras. I think they're probably pretty happy that they've got them now, once a lot of these cases have been able to be cleared out pretty quick. Tasers is another thing that we addressed with the Chief City years ago, that, we needed, we recommend that he get with certain legislators to try to get more money for tasers. So there's a lot, that we do. We also write recommendations to the chief of things that we disagree with. We don't always agree with some of the actions that have taken place, and we let him know that. We also let the investigative part of that process know that we didn't agree with different things. We've, have wrote a letter to Chief City on another incident to where there was an officer rehired that we just didn't believe needed to be back on the street. And so these are things that we do address. We're getting ready to have a meeting on Saturday. So, I'm open to being able to talk with anybody about those, but different cases, but I can't get into any specifics. So.
Right. And I think it's important that we understand that this is about strengthening civilian oversight. This is not about where we are because we're still here in Oklahoma City addressing these issues. And it's not an issue of defending yourself from any aspect or anything. It's a matter of working together to make it better and to change the way things are going down. So I think the first part we outlined with the Oversight Subcommittee was to review what we have now and do an assessment of the current Citizens Advisory Board to see what components we can build on. And if it's a matter of funding, staffing, capacity, whatever the case, this is the group to talk about how we make that stronger and better. So we have to be open and aware that this is a conversation about strengthening oversight of the OKC, building better community and police relations, and just making for a safer city. So those types of things all happen as we kind of create a process of strengthening and making these changes to make the components better.
We
I'll
have
agree with
got,
that.
I'm sorry.
I just said I agree with everything he said.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mannix. And thank you, Ray. Now, one of the things I want to do right here is we still have our panelists on here. And so I've got maybe 5 hands raised. Are any of those questions? Somebody wave your hand at me. Let me, who has a question for the panelists? Because if we're through with the panelists, then we need to give them an opportunity to leave if they would like. So I see that Garland's hand is waving. So Garland, go ahead. I see you, Joshua. I'll call you next.
Okay, for the panelists, is there a process or a procedure that you all have previously used when it comes to an officer that is killed more than once? In other words, like we're talking about the Citizens Advisory Board, and I inquired earlier about whether or not we had subpoena power, investigation power. Have any of your oversight committees, task force had the power to say, this guy is killed twice, what do we need to do to get him off the street and put him in a desk? Because that's what we're confronted with right now.
Yeah.
In 2021.
No, yeah, we do. You know, that comes up in a lot of cities, and most oversight agencies do not have the power to make those types of personnel changes. In fact, in a lot of states, they actually make it so that only the chief can issue discipline or terminate people. So that is a legal limitation. I'm sorry.
Recommendation, do they accept recommendations from those particular committees and form, in any form?
Oh, yeah. I mean, depending on how you set up everything, like you see a lot of agencies that are very weak because they're not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to weigh in on discipline, or they're not allowed to weigh in on policy. You want to be able to weigh in on everything with this.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, next question, Joshua Higginbotham.
Yeah, so one of the specific qualifications that you must meet to be on the Citizens Advisory Board, for our board specifically, is that you cannot have been convicted of a felony or have received a deferred sentence for a felony. And I think there are some problems with that. And I wanted to know, is that kind of a standard thing for Citizens Advisory Boards in cities you've worked with, and what your advice was, or if you thought that that should maybe be removed?
I mean, again, I'll just say quickly, because I think others may know more, that it does come up. It's certainly not unheard of. I don't think it's a good practice. I have some understanding of why, but if you have a board of people and they can do the job and you've interviewed them and you trust them, and if they have to sign paperwork, then you should be able to have people who have lived experience in a range of different ways. So it does come up. I think in the current environment, there's a lot of interest in getting rid of those kinds of rules where they exist.
Just want to agree with that.
Tisha Reed Dickerson.
My question, and again, thank you all for your time and for your labor put into this, is around how successful have you been with agencies that have more of an absolutism or autocratic leadership style? When we're having to deal with situations to where we talked about early on, it was kind of presented like it doesn't matter what suggestions or recommendations we make. The decision and how change will happen depends on if it is accepted by basically the union. And so that to me is problematic. If you automatically anticipate or expect a certain level of pushback from those that do not want to dismantle those systems, especially the systems that are so prevalent as far as white supremacy that exist within policing. Also, it kind of leads to, or goes back to what Mr. Higginbotham just said. If you believe in the system, the judicial system and the process, when we say someone has actually served their time and it is supposed to be rehabilitative, and we're not really working with restorative or transformative justice, then why, if someone has already quote unquote done their time, would they not be able to give much value to a system like that of the Oversight Committee? I mean, do we believe what the principles that everything is set up on, or are we saying that that needs to be overhauled as well?
You know, it's really interesting because, you know, having always been out and doing community resource work in every one of my jobs, I really didn't understand how much oversight was kind of sitting in the corner, right, with criminal justice reform happening all around it, right? And I think in the last 7-8 years that I've been involved with NACOL, we've really realized how much a part of that criminal justice reform is touching our work, right? How many people we have that are really asking for that plus more, right? And so it's important that you do have that conversation, not only amongst yourselves, but within the communities. And I would start having those conversations with other places in Oklahoma and beyond. Tulsa has been organizing for a really long time. Tiffany Crutchner, Terrence Crutcher's sister, started a foundation, and they actually went 2 years they fought for oversight in Tulsa and really had a bunch of people that really were well educated on oversight mechanisms and how to get things done. And they had a lot of the same problems with pushback from the police unions and pushback from, you know, council members and such. And so it seems to me like you guys actually should be all kind of learning together and learning from people who know what your state laws are like and reaching out to them. She's wonderful. She's been on a couple of panels for us at NACOL, and she's just really a wealth of information for a lot of this same stuff. And I'm sure she'd love to talk to you guys in the future as you plan and work. But it is all a part of criminal justice reform. And a lot of us believe that that's just not right. You know, the ban the box happened in a lot of different states, you know, many, many years ago. It definitely should be visited in other states.
Thank you. We certainly talked to Dr. Crutcher, but we also understand the difference of having a strong mayor system and a weak mayor system. So that's one of the things that we're also up against. But thank you so much.
I do have 2 hands up. I'm going to call on someone who has not commented today. That would be James Cooper.
Thank you, MT. Super quick question. And first, just thank you to everybody for your participation today, especially our panelists. My question is more related to the town hall on the 12th. I have a concern that just from talking with residents, there seems to not be always an understanding of the distinctions between what we're trying to accomplish in the law enforcement task force versus what the community policing working group is trying to accomplish. So I guess it's both like a comment and a question in terms of the framing of Tuesday evenings or the 12th, whatever day that is. Time's a blur to me anymore. But I heard earlier, and I love that approach of making sure that we're hearing not only what are people's responses to the 2 items in the law enforcement task force group and the 6 in the community policing resolution, and just hearing what's on folks' minds generally. Is it possible that at the start of that conversation that we actually do lay out for folk, like, here's what the law enforcement task force is discussing in terms of the 2 policy or 2 different ideas, and then here are the 6 ideas in the community policing group, and then, you know, even maybe even mentioning the Human Rights Commission conversation as well, and then just being like, and then whatever else is on y'all's mind. In other words, like making sure that people know, here's some of the direction we're heading. What do you think about these ideas? You like them, you hate them, you're in the middle, and what else is on your mind?
So thank you for that, Councilman Cooper, and I will address it. What I'm going to do is be very respectful, because giving up 2 hours of your time is a lot to ask of very busy folks. And so I am going to thank our panelists for being here today. And we may reach back out to you, you know, moving forward, but I just really want to appreciate you for showing up today and helping us in this process. So I'll let you go, and then we'll continue to conduct the business of the task force. Thank you so very much.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Wishing you well.
You're very welcome. And keep us informed, and, you know, I'm always happy to help out. I know all of us are. So thank you for your work, and we will see you soon, I'm sure.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So Councilman Cooper, that's exactly what we were planning to do. We were going to say, you know, here, you know, was the impetus for the task force being set up. There's also a working group. These groups are focused on these 2 issues, these 6 issues. And we may do a couple of reminders as the session goes on. But my experience is that the more you try to tell people what to say as it relates to something this important to them, you know, it doesn't go well. So I hear you, and we will set those parameters. But even on this task force, we talk about way more than just the 2 issues. And we're all very well informed about what our tasks are. So we're going to try to do that, but obviously can go a couple of different ways.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. MC, you're muted.
How about that? Thank you. Josh Harris-Teal.
Good. Here's my question was really kind of directed towards the panelists, but I guess I would also direct it towards the task force in general, because we have been doing this for months, and we unfortunately haven't taken an opportunity or had the opportunity to vote on anything or put out a statement. We've made the opportunity for the community to speak with us, but we haven't really shown the community that we have made a decision on anything yet. And because of that, there are contingencies who would like to work around the task force instead of with the task force or within the confines of what's been created here. I don't have to tell you all the importance of the work that we're doing here or remind you of the urgency in which action is needed. But I will say that in terms of optimism, you know, I'm probably one of the most optimistic people on the task force. I truly believe that we can come together and put out something that the community can get behind, that the police can get behind, that the Citizens Advisory Board can get behind, that can create a better working environment for all of us. But we have to start putting something out sooner rather than later so that we can maintain credibility in these communities. A lot of folks feel that this task force was created to placate us and kick the can down the road and kind of sweep it under the rug when people were not paying as much attention or didn't care as much. And that's not my feelings. I talked to the mayor, right? We've had numerous conversations. I've talked to city council members. I've talked to a number of you. I do believe that we are here to do great work, but I do believe that time is not on our side in terms of continuing to have meetings like these where 100% appreciate the folks who have provided expert opinions, but a lot of it is the same stuff that we've been talking about since the first meeting. And I don't say that to take away from the fact that we need to bring in these validators, but I say that to say, I think there are things that we all agree on that we can put out soon or start talking about in a little more high level of a conversation so that the community can feel like the task force is actually doing the work that it was intended to do. And that's just kind of my concern or my issue, or honestly, I'm really tired. I just got back into the country and this is my 5th meeting of the day. I have back-to-back meetings after this. This is one that I really care about. This is one I want to see be successful. If there's anything that I can do in order for us to be more successful, I'm willing to do it. If anybody wants to meet and flesh out ideas they have, I'm more than willing to do that. But I would just beg of us that we start to push for something actionable or something tangible to come from the task force soon so that we have something to take back to the community and say, look, we don't have everything, we're not done working, but this is something that we have all agreed upon, that we can say that we will submit to the city council. I think, you know, if anything, the Cahoots and mental health program, that's something that seems to be moving in that direction. Let's flesh that out. Let's make it happen. Let's put it out so that the community can see something from that. And then let's tell them, hey, we're still working after that. I'm super grateful to Carnisha, Sharita, Craig, MT, Cherie, Sarah, all of you, you know, you come here and you invest time, effort, and energy into this. And I think that we're doing great work, but I just really think that the longer we don't put out something tangible, the harder it's going to be to get the entire community on our side when the time comes. And if we fail, that's not just on us as the activists, that's on the city, right? And that's only going to harshen the relationships that we're trying to currently mend. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you, MT.
Thank you, Joshua. And I certainly understand your frustration and concern. And right now, what we're presenting and things that we've got planned to do were things that the committee asked for. But before I even go into that, let's go back and for just a second, revisit why this task force was put in place. And I'll read from you the comments that the mayor made at our first meeting as it relates to this task force. He says, in this room, you have a defined mission. You are being asked to revisit our city's law enforcement policies as they pertain to, number one, de-escalation, and number two, accountability back to the residents, a function currently performed by a Citizens Advisory Board. You are asked to develop recommendations for change that represent a consensus of the people in this room and the communities you represent, so that the council and the city manager may act on those recommendations. And so everything that we're doing right now, at least from my viewpoint, is trying to get everybody informed and educated enough that you can determine what your recommendations are going to be, that we will be taking back on both those issues to the mayor. And let me see, Craig, you have anything to comment on as it relates to any of that?
No, I don't have a lot to add, but I do understand Josh's frustration, and really many people
As do I.
with the task force that understand the frustration. And I think there are some areas where some of these are just complicated enough that I think trying to hurry through them is going to be difficult. There could be legislative issues, whether it be on the local level or a state level. There could be contract issues with the FOP, things that we've got to work through as we work through some of those recommendations. But I do think there's other areas we haven't gone into it yet, and I know there's been discussion about it, but one of the things that we're looking at with 21CP is they've been pulling some information on body cam video, even on release of body cam video. I think there are some things like that that are related to those two topics that MT just talked about, that we can look at trying to move forward more quickly with some of those so that there can be some action that's seen. So I think it's something that we'll take to heart, definitely, and working with 21CP, take that into consideration. We're trying to make sure we're hearing all the voices between them being able to visit with all the team members with the task force, as well as in the community with either targeted, but like Kanisha was saying, with some of the focus groups or like the town hall meeting. And so I think we're going to take all that into consideration. But I do think there are some areas that are related into those two primary topics where the task force could come out with some recommendations. And so I think it's something that we can look at some areas where we can be in a position to bring recommendations forward soon.
And if I may just add to that, I did have a conversation with the Joshes this week. And what was relayed to me was that there is some consensus perhaps around not only with the FOP, but with the police and community activists around the alternative to 911 calls for folks in mental and behavioral health crisis. And I have committed to bring that issue, Josh, I was going to call you today, to the working group, because that lies directly within their purview in their next meeting on Tuesday. And if we can come out of that with a recommendation for Craig, then maybe that's one thing that we can consider in addition to the other things that he mentioned. So we did hear you loud and clear. The only thing that concerned me as far as voting, and maybe we'll take that up in the next meeting, is our next two meetings are going to be focused on, here are the words, here are some recommendations, what do you all think? My hope was that would be coming from the subcommittees, but with people not showing up to the subcommittees, we're just gonna have to rock and roll with what we have unless you all come in the next month. But you will have the opportunity to react to to some concrete words. The other thing you can do at any time is send written recommendations to us for us to present to the larger group. But we will also get with MT and Kenny in the interim around voting and how that process is going to work. I don't know that you all have talked about whether there has to be a quorum, what that looks like, but we want to be respectful of the space so everybody's voice is heard and respected as it relates to a consensus around some of these issues. So I did want to just add that 2 cents.
Thanks, Kanisha. Joshua, we hear you. Anyone else?
Yeah, MT, one of the things that our Citizens Advisory Board has been working on, it's similar to what Craig was saying about body worn cameras. We've kind of put together something we'll probably submit to you as well that deals with when those cameras need to be on and when they need to finally get shut off, because there's a lot of times when they reach the jail that there's no body worn camera that's on. And so, there's recommendations that we're putting forward that we have seen with some of the cases we've looked at that really needs to be put into some sort of policy, and I'm not sure how that's going to be worked out with the FOP, but it sure helps with our procedures when we're reviewing these cases to where we can see it from the time that they stop the individual, from the time, and if they do take them into custody and take them to jail, we need to keep that video going even inside the car, because a lot of those complaints are about when they're in the car. And so when that's off, we're not able to review. And so this is something that our panel or our board has discussed. And so it's something we'll be, probably recommending to the task force. So.
Okay, thanks, Mannix. Grace Franklin.
I'm unmute. Okay, here. Okay, so just want to say real briefly, I know everybody's tired, everybody's eyes are glassed over. There are two of us, right? There are two task force. There's the big one, there's the small one. I'm on both of them. And what I will say for the smaller working group, we are pushing to have recommendations ready for the city council. And we are pushing for what we feel like will work best, the alternative that will work best and will be able to get funded right now. I hope there is a way for us to bring that and keep that into consideration to the larger group, so you all will know what the smaller working group is doing, because we are the group that is going to be working on the mental health process. And we have certain information that the larger group may not have. So we are working on that plan right now. I know I can say for the smaller group, we are working to have something ready now that can be implemented coming up on the next process. And I know everybody's frustrated and tired, and I agree with Joshua Harris Teal. We do need to get something out to the community to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're pushing for, and this is the date in which we need you all to show up. Because I would agree with him, the community is tired, they don't know what we're doing, they think we just gather and just keep talking, which, that's what it feels like. So just know that we are trying to push and move forward. And I hope, again, the smaller group can maybe present some things, get some ideas from the larger group so we can make this very effective. This is a lot of time spent, and I think it's very important for us to have something that's doable and movable by June. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Grace. The only other thing that I know that I would like to say at this point is that, again, on this coming Monday, April the 12th at 6 p.m., we will have our first virtual town hall to discuss some of the things that from the community, what their issues are, what their concerns are. So let me ask all of you to, if you haven't yet, put the flyer for that on your social media, put it out there so that people know that this is going on, so that we can get the people there, and asking as many of you to also attend that meeting. And I would also ask that those of you that can attend the committee meetings, the subcommittee meetings, so that we can start getting this thing into where it looks like we're doing something maybe a little bit more productive. Okay?
MT, when is the subcommittee meeting?
Ganesha?
I put my notes away. Let me grab it. It's on Thursdays and Fridays. Okay. So the Civilian Oversight Subcommittee is every other Thursday, which one was this week at 4:30. And I'm going to send this all out so you guys can easily have access to it with the Zoom. And then the de-escalation subcommittee is every other Friday at 3 o'clock. Both of those happen this week, so one won't happen next week. It'll be the week after, but I'll make sure that we send this out to you all so you can easily access it.
Okay, thank you, Ganesha. Anybody else? Any other business before the committee before we adjourn? Yes, Garland. Were you raising your hand to speak,
Got a
Garland?
call from, yeah, I got a call from someone. That's another task force meeting that's supposed to be taking place tomorrow evening. Are you aware of anything of that nature
I am
with the
not.
police department?
I'm not aware of anything of that nature. Is the chief still on?
Oh, I bet you I know what you're talking about, Garland. Maybe I have been in contact with someone named Dee Brooks or Dee Brock, who is associated with NAACP. She has graciously agreed to have a listening session with me with about 8 people at 6 o'clock tomorrow. I know so that may be what you're hearing about. It's a small group. It's not a large group.
All right.
Okay.
And I piggyback on everything that was said. That was what my goal was saying by, if we've been meeting, we'll just say 6-9 months, we're still seeing killings in the last 6-9 months, that our program, our process, our procedure, something about it is not working. And that's what the general public is looking at, is looking for results, not conversation, some policies, some laws, some changes in place to hold us accountable. Folks are pointing their finger at us. You, me, the police department, the city, and all organizations. If they don't see something tangible, this policy has been put in place. I mean, someone made mention of the 8 can't wait been put in place. Who knows on here right now what the 8 can't wait is? You understand what I'm saying? That's already been put in place, I was told. Like I've recommended a bunch of different recommendations, haven't seen a one, haven't had any discussion concerning any. So we have to have something done. I agree. So now we got what? How many more months left for the contract? How many more months left? 3 or 4 months. We've been said a year later, what's been accomplished, what's been achieved, what's in place, what's been implemented. That's what the general public is saying.
Thanks, Garland. Hope we understand. Anyone else? Thank you, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.
Have a good evening, everyone.